Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure, on behalf of the Archaeological Institute of America, to welcome you to tonight's Archaeology Hour. This evening, we are going to go on a journey about archaeology's distant past and its present, and about how we can think about a more ethical archaeology and museum practice in the future. The Archaeological Institute of America, since 1879, has been thinking about and working to make archaeology happen. It is North America's largest and oldest archaeological organization, with nearly 150,000 members worldwide. People like you who are tuning in tonight, archaeologists, teachers and educators, people who publish, people who research, and advocates who work for site preservation. Our programs like the one tonight keep you up to date with what we've learned about archaeology and how we know it needs to change and update in the modern world. You can read about the work that archaeologists do in Archaeology magazine, which has over 700,000 readers per issue, which includes in-depth stories and archaeological highlights and snippets from the field of archaeology practicing archaeologists, who will share with you their insights about our field. We encourage you to think about how to experience archaeology, whether by attending a lecture like tonight, or a fair, or any of the events organized by our local societies or our collaborating organizations. We encourage you to stay connected with us, and you can scan the QR code here on the screen to become a member and join our community. We encourage you to become a member, to join a society, to become eligible for different kinds of AIA grants and other kinds of discounts, and to subscribe to Archaeology magazine. Finally, we do encourage you to support the AIA. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the generosity of donors to support our mission. Although the AIA is congressionally chartered, it does not receive federal funds, and we rely on the support of viewers and the public like you. Archaeology Hour is a series of virtual lectures, and it always excites me to see just how many people come on at dinner time to think about archaeology. And we have a really outstanding year that has been organized for us by our team at the AIA headquarters in Boston. And I want to particularly thank Meredith Langlitz for her work in pulling tonight's events together, and our ASL translators who are going to be working hard throughout this hour. Our next lecture is going to be Akin Angudorian from Northwestern University, talking about the metropolitan walls of the Oyo community. And so be sure to look for announcements about that event. As a friendly reminder, I want to just remind everyone here tonight that this lecture is a live presentation that's being recorded, and recording by attendees is prohibited. We respect the intellectual property of all of our presenters, and we request that all of our viewers do the same. Thank you for your cooperation in advance. It really gives me extraordinary pleasure to introduce Danyelle Means from the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture as our speaker tonight. And as your newly elected president who will serve the AIA for the next 3 years, I want to say for a moment in particular about what having Danyelle here tonight means for me. I began my career as an archaeologist not long after NAGPRA passed in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. At that time, I would say that this law was controversial. And there were many in the academic community who insisted that the only ethical path forward was to break the law. And I felt that was wrong. There were a lot of archaeologists that felt that it was wrong. And I remember very vividly at the time, one of my own mentors, Jeff Fentress, who was engaged in doing NAGPRA compliance work, said something that I've always held with me in the years since. you have to commit to NAGPRA. The kind of excavations that archaeologists did was wrong. The work of archaeology in the future is about healing. It's about returning ancestors back to communities. It's about returning objects that archaeologists never had consent to have back home. And I'd like to think that my own work as an archaeologist has contributed in very, very small ways to that really big goal of correcting that wrong. And I think that being now president of AIA has made me think about the responsibility of an organization like ours to being committed not just to NAGPRA, but what it means to go beyond NAGPRA, and for what it means for archaeologists and for Indigenous communities to chart new futures and new paths together. For me, that's the exciting vista of archaeology that we're still waiting to discover. That is the great discovery to be had about how we, together with our different perspectives, can actually make something known anew. And so I'm grateful to Danyelle for being here today to actually talk about the ways that she's thought about this as a leader, as a scholar, as someone who is the executive director of the Museum of Arts and Culture, and focus so much on the care and the interpretation and the stewardship of Native material culture in museum settings and beyond. Her work resonates deeply with the Southwest, and she oversees archaeological collections that in many ways we've all spent our careers now grappling with. She works with tribal historic preservation officers and Native communities about how to deal with NAGPRA collections and access, but ultimately what these really, truly significant issues of responsibility are. Her past work involves the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian Institution and the Institute of American Indian Arts, the Center for Contemporary Arts in Santa Fe, and the Southwestern Association of Indian Arts, all of these major organizations who are grappling with these issues too. Her perspective is so deeply grounded in Indigenous resilience, survivance, and knowledge building projects. I'm so grateful that she has joined us tonight, and I will now turn the virtual podium over to her. Thank you, Danyelle.
Thank you so much, Brian. I am really, really excited to be here for this evening. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for being here. I'm truly honored to join you for Archaeology Hour, and I appreciate the invitation to spend this time together. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the topic we're discussing tonight carries weight. We are talking about ancestors, about history, and about harm. But it's also about responsibility, learning, and the possibility of doing better together. My hope is that you'll listen not just with curiosity, but with openness. My name is Danyelle Means. I am a Native scholar, a museum director, and an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe. I grew up on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, and I currently serve as the executive director of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I want to take a moment and locate myself clearly in this conversation. I am not from the native Southwest. The ancestors whose care we are discussing tonight are not my relatives in a direct genealogical sense. That distinction matters, and I want to be honest about it from the beginning. But I am Native. And like many Native people in this country, I carry an understanding, an inherited understanding, that what happens to one tribal nation rarely happens in isolation. For much of US history, Native peoples have been treated as a single group by federal policy, by academic disciplines, by cultural institutions. Burial sites were excavated, ancestors were removed, cultural belongings were collected, and these actions rarely respected tribal boundaries, cultural differences, or community consent. Because of that history, Native communities across this country share a deep sense of solidarity. We understand that harm done to one community reverberates outward. And we also understand that healing, too, must be collective. That sense of solidarity shapes how I approach my work every day. As a museum director, I'm responsible for an institution that holds history, authority, and power. As a Native person, I am responsible to communities whose trust in institutions has been repeatedly broken. Holding both of those responsibilities at the same time requires care, humility, and listening. Tonight, I want to talk about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, often referred to as NAGPRA. Not as a legal statute full of technical language, but as a living framework. A framework that asks us to reflect on how museums, archaeologists, and the public relate to Native communities. A framework that asks us to consider what healing looks like after generations of extraction. And a framework that invites us to practice reciprocity, not as an abstract value, but as a daily responsibility. Many of you have noticed changes in museums over the last several years. You may have walked into a gallery and seen fewer objects on display. You may have noticed revised labels, new languages, or even empty cases where something once was. Those changes can feel surprising. They can feel confusing. And sometimes they raise questions like, why is this happening now? What changed? And what does this mean for museums and archaeology more broadly? This talk is meant to offer some context, not to assign blame and not to shame a field that in many ways has worked hard to reflect and evolve. But this is also to help explain why NAGPRA exists, how it's being carried out today, and why it matters. Who am I? I want to spend just a moment expanding on who I am in this work because positionality matters. My professional background, as Brian mentioned, is in museum studies and anthropology. I've spent my career in working in Native-led and Native-serving institutions. I've worked in national Native arts organizations, in community-based cultural work, and now in a state museum system that holds both opportunity and responsibility. At the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, we steward collections, exhibitions, and programs that carry enormous meaning for Native communities, especially in New Mexico, where tribal nations remain deeply present and actively engaged. I don't approach this work as a neutral administrator. I approach it as a Native person navigating institutions that were not built with us in mind. But now that is going to change. That dual role, both inside institutions and accountability to Native communities, shapes how I think about NAGPRA and why it matters. This conversation matters because the history that led to NAGPRA is not abstract. For generations, Native communities were excluded from decisions about their own ancestors. Archaeology and museums operated with authority that was rarely questioned, and Native voices were often dismissed or ignored completely. Ancestors were excavated and removed. Cultural belongings were collected and cataloged. And these actions were justified through ideas of science, preservation, and public benefit. But those benefits were not shared equally. The harm was carried by Native communities, emotionally, spiritually, and culturally. That harm did not end when collections were placed in storage. It continues until responsibility is taken and relationships are repaired. And that is why NAGPRA matters. I want to spend some time here because language is not a side issue in this work. It is central. The words we use shape how we think, how we act, and how we justify our decisions. In archaeology and in museums, language has often reflected institutional priorities rather than Indigenous values. For many decades, the term human remains has been the standard language used in collections, catalogs, and research. That term comes from a scientific framework, one that emphasizes objectivity, distance, and analysis. But Native communities speak of ancestors. That difference is not symbolic. It reflects fundamentally different way of understanding responsibility. Ancestors are not simply evidence of the past. They are our relatives. They remain in relationship with the living. They carry memory, obligation, and care. The same is true when we talk about objects versus cultural belongings. Objects imply ownership and detachment. Cultural belongings recognize that these items are part of living cultural systems. They have meaning, context, and responsibility attached to them. And finally, I want to touch on the shift from consultation to relationship. Consultation can sometimes imply a process that is finite, transactional, or compliance-driven. Relationship, on the other hand, implies time, accountability, and trust. It means showing up consistently, listening carefully, and being willing to change practice. These language shifts signal deeper ethical changes. They reflect a growing understanding that Indigenous authority must guide this work. NAGPRA exists because Native nations organized, advocated, and demanded recognition. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeology developed alongside colonial expansion. Excavation was framed as rescue. Collection was framed as preservation. And museums positioned themselves as neutral stewards of the past. But we have to ask, preservation for whom? Native burial sites were excavated without consent. Ancestors were removed from the ground and placed into institutional collections. Cultural belongings were collected and cataloged far from their communities. These actions were often justified through ideas of science, public benefit, and education. But the costs were borne by Native communities, emotionally, spiritually, and culturally. By the late 20th century, museums and universities in the United States held the remains of hundreds of thousands of Native ancestors. NAGPRA did not emerge from institutional generosity. It emerged from Indigenous resistance. It marked a turning point from institutions making unilateral decisions to Native nations asserting their inherent authority over their ancestors and cultural belongings. At a basic level, NAGPRA is a federal law passed in 1990. It requires museums and federal agencies to inventory what they hold, consult with tribes, and return ancestors and certain belongings, certain cultural belongings, when that affiliation can be established. But from an Indigenous perspective, NAGPRA is much more than a legal mechanism. It is a recognition, however imperfect, that tribal nations are sovereign governments with the right to decide what happens to their ancestors. That recognition challenges long-standing institutional habits. It asks museums to rethink how authority is exercised, how decisions are made, and whose knowledge matters. NAGPRA also requires patience. Relationship building does not move at the speed of grant cycles or institutional deadlines. It moves at the speed of trust. I'm going to say that again. Relationship building moves at the speed of trust. Understanding NAGPRA only as a compliance misses its deeper purpose. At its best, it is about repair. Repatriation is sometimes imagined as a transaction. Paperwork completed, items transferred, case closed. But for Native communities, repatriation is rarely that simple. Repatriation involves elders, spiritual leaders, families, and extended community conversations. It may involve ceremony. It may involve grief. And it often requires a lot of time. For museums, this can feel unfamiliar. Institutions are often structured around efficiency and outcomes. But repatriation is not about efficiency. It is about care. Museums are guests in this process. Repatriation done well builds trust. Repatriation done poorly can deepen harm. This is why relationship matters more than speed. Trust is built through consistency, humility, and listening. Not all repatriation cases are straightforward. Many institutions hold ancestors whose geographic or cultural origins cannot be clearly determined. This is often the result of earlier collecting practices that prioritized acquisition over documentation. Incomplete records are not neutral. They are part of the legacy of extraction. When provenance is unclear, it can create additional burdens for Native communities, asking them to fill gaps created by institutional practices. It is important to say clearly, unresolved affiliation is not a failure of Native communities. It is an institutional responsibility. NAGPRA asks institutions to sit with that responsibility rather than deflect it. In New Mexico, the Reburial Grounds Act provides a lawful pathway for respectful reinternment when no tribe has formally requested repatriation. This statute uses the term unclaimed, and it's important to handle that language carefully. Unclaimed does not mean unwanted. It does not mean forgotten. It does not mean that no one cares. Most often, it reflects incomplete records, unclear provenance, or geographic uncertainty created by earlier collecting practices. The Act acknowledges that even when affiliation cannot be resolved, ancestors deserve dignity and respect. And I am grateful to the state of New Mexico for creating such an act. This is an important example of how law can support ethical practice when approached thoughtfully. Museums around the country are changing in response to NAGPRA. You may notice revised labels or empty cases, and these changes can feel unsettling at first, but they're not erasures. They are acknowledgments. They reflect a growing understanding that museums must reckon honestly with how collections were formed, and that ethical responsibility sometimes means letting go. Museums are learning that stewardship does not always mean keeping. Sometimes it means returning. Last November, the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs hosted a statewide convening. It was intentionally not framed as consultation. Instead, it was designed as a forum, a space where tribes could ask questions, speak openly, and also acknowledge past harm across the state's many cultural institutions. We had over 38 tribes represented, alongside 120 participants, including state agencies that hold responsibility. That distinction mattered. Creating space for truth rather than compliance changed the tone of the conversation. Acknowledgement has power. When institutions are willing to name harm without defensiveness, it changes relationships. It creates the possibility for trust. Trust is not built through policy alone. It is built through listening, accountability, and sustained presence. Acknowledgement doesn't erase harm, but it creates the conditions for moving forward together. The public plays a meaningful role in this work. Museums respond to public values. When visitors notice changes, ask questions, and seek to understand why practices are shifting, it reinforces ethical accountability. Supporting museums that prioritize Indigenous authority and ethical practice helps create space for healing. This is not passive work. It is shared responsibility. I want to close by returning to the title of this talk. NAGPRA is not only about returning ancestors. It is about how institutions choose to act today. It offers a path, not just toward compliance, but toward healing and reciprocity. That path requires patience. It requires humility. And it requires relationship. Thank you for being a part of that work and spending this time together with me tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danyelle, for that wonderful, moving, and deeply heartfelt presentation. I want to invite everyone who is attending here tonight to put questions that they have in the Q&A, and we will get to as many as we can until we reach the end of the hour, because this is truly archaeology hour, and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. But while you're thinking of your questions and putting them in the Q&A, I want to sort of start us off by asking Danyelle, from your position now as a museum leader, of many different cultural institutions, and especially the one you're at now, what inspires you right now about this moment in museums? And what are you thinking about? And where do you think the future may go?
That's an excellent question, because I think one of the things that came out of the convening, to have 38 tribes come together, to have all of those people in the same room, what I see and what I know is that there's a real want to be able to tell the stories from our own perspective. And that is what I want to highlight. I began my career at the National Museum of the American Indian way back in the 90s. And one of the things that I think was really important with the establishment of that museum was that we were going to get Native story from a Native perspective. And now, coming to the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, I come into an institution that has established an Indian advisory panel that has been around for over 20 years. So what NAGPRA is wanting us to do in establishing these relationships, MIAC has been doing for 20 years. And Brian, that repatriation is a complicated process. And to me, having a community of members from each community to advise me on how to move this process forward, to me is I feel like I have an unfair advantage over all the rest of the museums, because this has been the way MIAC has moved throughout its time, established in 1987. It has always had this connection back to the communities it represents. And that's incredibly important. So I'm really excited that hopefully NAGPRA helps build these relationships between museums and the communities, the belongings that are a part of these uh, museums end up becoming the way that people really are able to express their stories, their culture, the meaning on which these items have been collected. And that to me is establishing those relationships and building those relationships only makes us better storytellers in the end.
So I think that that sort of prefaces a question that I see coming across a lot from a lot of our attendees tonight. And that really is, what kind of influence, or whether it's at MIAC or NMAI or these other major institutions, where does that influence go? How do we see the sort of downstream effects that at museums where you're not the director, and especially at museums where we're thinking about internationally that also hold Native ancestors and other cultural belongings where NAGPRA doesn't apply. So how do you see NAGPRA really driving, and not just NAGPRA, but these conversations around NAGPRA, reimagining the museum field more broadly?
Well, I think one aspect of this that has sort of permeated museums is now there is an authority established, and I think part of the update of NAGPRA in January of 2024 was really about not just the ancestors and their belongings, but this idea of duty of care, that that this law isn't just about the return of the ancestors. It's about, now that you have this relationship established, ask more questions about the rest of the objects in your collection. Ask more opportunities for community members to participate in exhibition planning and exhibition design. How do we display archaeology? That's something I'm asking my curators, my archaeologists. How do we talk about archaeology in a Native context? And that to me is really exciting. And I think that part of duty of care that is part of the new update to NAGPRA, to me, is about that relationship building. And if that can be done, I do think that institutions are that much stronger for it. And you see it across the country. I've been to several different institutions giving talks like this to really reinforce, what 1990 was, where I think museums were very afraid that tribal communities would come, park their box truck and load up all of their items and leave. And that didn't happen. And I think it's taken museums and institutions a while to try and come to this point where you do need to consult, you do need to ask questions, and look, here's a list of all of these tribal historic preservation officers who can give you answers to your questions or point you in the direction of Native scholars who can actually comment and create that relationship between museums and communities.
Yeah, and I think that one of the interesting points that you're drawing out is that there's also, I think, this. I mean, this was true among museums, of course, in the 1990s, about the fear of that proverbial truck coming up to the back of the museum and taking everything away. But I think there's a durability of how difficult this topic is to understand. When people think of archaeology, they think about Indiana Jones, they think about Laura Croft. I mean, there's a certain kind of imaginary around what archaeology is that we as archaeologists try and reimagine we're trying to reimagine, rework the field of archaeology. I mean, that's very difficult. I mean, how do you think that the field of archaeology can help help engage the topic of repatriation and really enhance the public sensibility and awareness of what repatriation means, especially because, as you point out so eloquently, it's not just the transfer of ancestors or cultural belongings, it's fundamentally about relationship building.
Well, and I think one of the ways that archaeology has done that is by reaching out to Native communities to train community members to help with whether it's a road project through a reservation or a Pueblo community. In fact, the state it has here in New Mexico has funded, with the governor's approval, an archaeology school. So there's a field school where Native community members can also participate and be a part of that. I think, if you went back 30 years, I think you wouldn't have found too many Native archaeologists. And so it's we're a part of the system, if you will, now. There weren't that many Native museum directors. And so we're now more in the process of this. And I think it's that collaboration. I think, the fear has in some ways dissipated. And we're certainly never going to have a time when we're not doing archaeology. And when I studied anthropology, one of the things that was very interesting to me was the analysis of some of the items that had been found. And I was in an art history class, and we were talking about Olmec figurines, which for the art historical world were fertility figurines. My question was, were they or were they toys? How do we analyze and talk about what is the process? And so archaeology has filled in those gaps. That there is evidence that we've learned from archaeology, but it is, do we continue to hold all of that material in museums and not in some way learn from what we have and move forward by repairing communities who really feel that this has in some way impacted them, whether it's culturally, spiritually, or just in a way of hurt. And so to be able to do the important work of getting the ancestors home, I think is the most important aspect of the new update, to spur museums to get those ancestors back home, but then to keep the work up to talk about how do we display archaeology, how do we talk about archaeology, and how do we work together to make sure that as we move through it, we have an incredible vast amount of material to talk about, to display, to enjoy. And so I think archaeology has really moved, at least I've seen it in the last 30 years, in an amazing direction of helping Native people to really understand and find the materials that they want returned home.
And I think it's interesting that you point out that, I mean, archaeology here both can be a major contributor in acting to help support that kind of return. And I know that we have a number of viewers, and watching you tonight, who are all asking, in the Q&A about what more can archaeology be doing? I mean, how can people who are entering the field right now be contributing to this overall effort? And I wonder how you might answer that.
To me, it's working with the communities. And if, one of the things that we have here at MIAC is we are the repository for all New Mexico archaeology. And, being able to have interns and volunteers and, a lot of CRM firms or the contractors doing these archaeological digs, to me, it is about connecting with those communities and understanding how their work impacts those communities. So doing talks in community, that to me is a really important aspect of understanding what the work of archaeology is. Sometimes it's about being on a road project and there's a recovery. Working with Native communities to say, let's just take these ancestors and move them adjacent to this location so we're not disturbing this burial. The road can go through. But if that's not communicated to Native communities, or Native communities aren't asked to come in, that's where the harm happens, is when there isn't that back and forth, that conversation between Native communities and archaeologists. And I think, here in New Mexico, that has been happening for many, many years. I really do not want to imply that this is the fault of archaeology. It isn't. This is the situation that we're in, and we need to move forward and understand how when there's a site that is going to be excavated, that Native communities be involved in that so that they can lend those conversations, expound upon what this may or may not be. And then we all learn from that. And so I think there are a tremendous amount of opportunities for archaeologists and those just entering the field to really gain some incredible knowledge from Native communities that will only enhance their work moving forward.
I see that one of the themes that keeps coming up and again in the Q&A is the language that we're using, both as archaeologists but also practitioners who are working on NAGPRA. I mean, how do we go further in actually using respectful language? And I'm seeing words like the importance of respect, the importance of building trust. What are the first kinds of steps of respect that you recommend that archaeologists or other museum practitioners take in this space?
So what was very important to me were establishing, when I got here, the cultural protocols. So for many of the communities here, we have 19 pueblos, Navajo Nation, Apache nations. We need to know what those protocols are so that we can respectfully handle or not handle objects. So, for example, one of the cultural protocols is that our ancestors are housed in a particular location, and women are not allowed to be around or handle the ancestors. That was a protocol that I really wanted our staff to follow. My entire staff is female. And so this was going to have an impact on whether or not we could check boxes or be in relationship to some of the ancestors. And so to me, it was incredibly important to have the Indian Advisory Panel come in and talk to my staff about why that was important. Again, these cultural protocols vary from tribe to tribe, from nation to nation. And so it's not a one and done, but that is a singular step that museums can do to say, you know what, We understand. We need you to come into the museum and let us know what is culturally sensitive, what should be sequestered by gender, what can we do to make sure that the consultations that we plan are done in the most respectful way possible. So those are things that I implemented, and it wasn't without, some resistance. And I think that's part of the accountability that I talked about, is that as a leader, I feel responsible and will be accountable to these nations to respect the protocols that they design for me to be able to work directly with them. So, for example, I said that my entire staff is female. We call upon our Indian advisory panel members to come in and help us on those occasions that we do need to be in contact with either ancestors or with their belongings. And that to me is a really important and very easy first step with other institutions to reach out to Native communities and ask for those protocols. That shows that you are listening, that you are taking that first step to be able to show respect and be a good partner in the repatriation process.
And a lot of what you're talking about, of course, is the evolution of how museums are thinking about these issues. What would you say about changes that you've seen in universities and the role that universities can play in the education process for undergraduates and graduate students who are thinking about careers in museums or archaeology and thinking about these changes of relationship to Native communities as well?
So I don't have a lot of experience with universities. I think one of the things, and we do work with the Maxwell Museum and the University of New Mexico, so much because New Mexico is so rich in archaeology. Having those institutions like the Maxwell, like MIAC, really being able to provide, whether that's internships, whether that's a pipeline to positions, that the way that repatriation and archaeology is taught, I think has to include this kind of reciprocity that we're talking about tonight. And it does have to, in some ways, prepare these students for these difficult conversations. And I think, it goes back to what we were talking about with this idea that, Native communities were going to come and take everything away. That just didn't happen. I think universities need to also prepare students for these hard conversations, and maybe even prepare them for a potential conflict, because this isn't cut and dry. It doesn't just happen naturally. At the convening, for example, we held in November, I was called on the carpet for MIAC having 35 years and only doing a handful of repatriations. That's a responsibility I didn't cause, but it's my accountability and accepting the responsibility for doing things better that makes it a possibility for us to have really good relationships moving forward. I have to acknowledge the harm. I have to have those hard conversations in order for us to move things forward. So I think that's part of it. There is conflict resolution. There is a lot of preparation that young people really do need to see and be a part of. And maybe that's bringing tribal historic preservation officers into the classroom to really talk about the harm that has been caused, the understanding that these ancestors have been, in some cases in our own museum, have been here for decades on a shelf. What does that do to the communities? How does that impact their ceremonies? How does that impact their daily activity in community? And so really understanding that so much of what we know about native culture comes directly from the communities that we represent. So it's super important to have that connection early on, and then we can move forward in a much better way.
So I think it's interesting about talking about preparation for these very difficult conversations. And I want to ask you one final question. We're, of course, living in a particularly difficult moment for having many of these conversations, not just because of the weight of our collective historical responsibility, our institutional and organizational responsibility, but the political moment that we're living through. And I want to acknowledge that Lisa Koseleski from National NAGPRA, is with us tonight. And I definitely encourage all of our viewers to reach out to National NAGPRA if they have questions about, how NAGPRA works and operates. But this is a challenging political moment. And I asked you at the start of Q&A about what you were most optimistic about. As a museum director, as a Native leader, what are you concerned about right now?
Well, I think there's a sense that how do we restrict the information or the objects or the display of objects? How do we do that in a way that is? I'm already getting questions from concerned collectors. Is all of my material going to just be repatriated? We have a responsibility as a museum to steward these collections. And what is most concerning to me really is that there's a sense that every single object that's given to a museum, every donation is going to somehow be on display. And that is just not possible. And so I'm concerned about the concern I'm getting back from collectors about wanting to make sure that their collections are on display. And that's something I can't guarantee, nor can I guarantee that that the museum is going to just continue in perpetuity to collect. And so understanding, political climate aside, understanding that what the time frame we're in is changing, and what is the role of museums? How do we shift from this idea of gathering all of this material, and how do we change that perspective, or perspective from the collector point of view, that everything they give us has a right to be displayed and not repatriated. And so I'm walking a fine line here between really advocating for NAGPRA and, as with any museum, being very concerned about how I also continue to raise funds through donors, through private foundations, through grants. How do I continue to do that? Managing expectations of what and how the museum is going to look 20 years in the future. And so it's something that is a constant. So I appreciate the question, but now I'm even more concerned.
Well, what I would say is I think that I end with this sense that I think that you're absolutely right, Danielle. We're living through a great moment, this great shift that is occurring both in museums and in archaeology. And with leaders like you, Danielle, I feel very confident about what this future will bring. Thank you
Well,
so
back
much.
at you, Brian.
I really appreciate everyone joining us tonight for the conversation. This is an important one. And thank you for joining the AIA this evening.